first, because I'm last, I think I should take the time to thank our conference organizers and the organizers of this project. So thank you so much, John and Dan and Trent, and also thank you, John, for your help, and Eunice, wherever you are. He's
not dead. That's not what we got. He just moved on to another project.
Thank you. Cool. Thank you all so much for coming and wrapping up lunch early so that you could be here. Does everyone hear me okay? Is this level? Okay. Okay. Awesome. So a lot of you have heard the first draft of this talk. The goal of the talk is to figure out whether Aristotelians, neo-Aristotelians, can make faith a virtue. And the reason I think this question, can Aristotelians make faith a virtue, is interesting, if it's not obvious, is that, well, who talks about virtue in normative ethics? Usually they're Aristotelians. Kant has the doctrine of virtue, and that's cool and interesting, but very few Kantians are interested in like imperfect duties and the doctrine of virtue, and so they're doing the second critique and whatnot. So we should expect, like, if we're all talking about faith and how valuable it is because it's a virtue, we should expect that, like, when we walk into the ethics world, our allies will be the Aristotelians. And then when I started thinking about faith, I thought, well, there are some things that are in tension with what Aristotelians say about the nature of virtue and what people in epistemology and philosophy of religion are saying about faith as a virtue. So I wanted to explore that tension and figure out, like, okay, what would an Aristotelian have to change to make this work, or what would the faith people have to change to make this work? So that's where the motivation for the paper comes from. So I think that the recent literature on faith gives us really compelling reasons for thinking that faith is a virtue. It has this status because it allows ordinary people to secure these goods that are necessary for their flourishing. And there are lots of accounts of how this works. I'll talk about them briefly. And it does this by overcoming a certain kind of cognitive or epistemic obstacle to goods that are necessary for our flourishing. So one of these obstacles might be, oh, we have cognitive faculties that lead us to misleading evidence, or to be impoverished when it comes to our evidence, or to have like a conflicting view of the reasons that apply to us, whether they're practical or epistemic, or maybe like the practical reasons conflict with the epistemic ones, or maybe synchronic rationality and diachronic rationality conflicts because of the sorts of creatures that we are and the perspective we inhabit. And faith is this thing that allows us to achieve certain goods that we really need in order to live well, but because of these cognitive impairments, it would be really hard to achieve that without faith. So if you think about, for instance, Luke, has everyone seen the new Star Wars movie? I don't like. No. Okay. I assumed, like, it sold out for weeks, so there. Okay. Have you all seen the episode that comes before this one, like episode 6? Maybe. Okay, if you haven't, I'm sorry, you've had like many decades. So Luke is just convinced that his father has like some ray of light in him, and that because of this, when he goes to battle him, man to man, Darth Vader's going to spare Luke's life, and then he's going to be able to save the Empire. But all of the evidence, including like what Yoda says and Obi-Wan Kenobi and all his friends are like, no, Luke, that's so stupid. All of your evidence is like pointing towards he's just going to kill you. But you think like there's this really great good, both for Luke and like for the entire galaxy, if Luke just has faith that there's something in Darth Vader that's going to be sympathetic and he's going to spare Luke's life. And it turns out Luke is right. And so it's like, oh, yeah, faith is a really good thing. So you might think, okay, Luke's faith is a virtue. Or like to take a more realistic example, you might think about a teacher in an underprivileged school or like low-performing elementary school who can see from test scores in her classroom that the students are probably going to fail the grade, but if the teacher continues to have faith in her students, despite the evidence, or maybe despite what turns out to be misleading evidence, she might be a better teacher. She might lead them to be successful, and some of the students pass, or something like this. So there are these great goods for the life of the teacher and the lives of her students that she can get just by having faith. And it doesn't seem like she can get them by leading or following the evidence as it appears to her initially or something like that. So you might think, okay, for adolescent Jedi and for teachers like this woman, sure, faith is a virtue, but is it a virtue for the fully virtuous agent, the person who has like all of the intellectual and moral virtues? I think that the Aristotelian is committed to saying no. And so in most of the talk, I'm going to explain why that is. And then I'll talk about what someone like me, who's like very sympathetic to Aristotelian virtue ethics, could do to reconcile these two intuitions, that faith really is a virtue. All of these arguments that people like in this room have given are compelling and not totally off the mark, but also there's something right about the Aristotelian framework. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the shape of the arguments for thinking that faith is a virtue. I don't take myself to be like establishing right now that it is a virtue. I'm just going to point to places where other people have established this. So on your handout, this is a little chart down here. I'm going to go through some of these views. Well, I could make an argument from authority and say, look, Laura Buchak says that the final desideratum for an account of faith is that it explains why faith can be a virtue. So, of course, if there is such a thing as faith, it's going to be a virtue, and someone is going to explain why it is a virtue. I'm not going to rely on that here, though. So we'll talk about some of the goods that are constitutive of human flourishing that faith allows us to achieve, uniquely allows us to achieve. So on one set of views, I'm just going to call them the relationship view, there's a good like friendship or solidarity with fellow humans, or some kind of other interpersonal relationship, like the relationship of teacher to pupil, or parent to child, or expert to non-expert, doctor to patient, sorts of relationships. They're all things that we need in order to flourish. They're important goods in human life, and we couldn't have them without faith. So Adams, Simon Keller, I think that, I'm actually not sure where Ted's view falls. I think maybe it's in the second group now. But I was going to say, if you think cooperation is a kind of relationship, maybe Ted's view is in here. Brian Preston Roeder's view about faith in humanity was one in this category. Sarah Stroud's view of epistemic partiality and friendship would also count here. So they all think these are goods that are really needed in order to flourish. But look, you actually can't be in one of these, or actually Rebecca's view I should include probably. So you can't be in a committed personal relationship that's genuine without faith. And the problem that we need to overcome, and that faith allows us to overcome here, is something like you have a lack of evidence that the person is really trustworthy, or that the person has your best interest in mind, or you have misleading evidence about how faithful the person is going to be to you. Or the evidence that's available to you is that the divorce rate is high, and so probably your spouse will be faithful and continue being committed to you the rest of your life. You might think, look, just in general, it seems like human beings are really immoral, so we don't have good reasons, epistemic reasons to have faith in humanity. That is, believe that people really are going to behave morally. That's Preston Roeder's view. And what faith allows you to do is to continue on in these relationships, even despite the misleading evidence or the reasons you seem to have to believe otherwise or to act otherwise. Another set of views, I'm just going to call them like the resilience and commitment views, though this might not be a good term for them, but I'm going to say that Laura Buchak's view and Dan's view and John's view all fall into this category. And the goods at stake here are things like your long-term projects, or a long-term commitment you have to someone, or anything which requires a kind of resilience to counter evidence. So that's why I included Dan's view here, but you can correct me if that's wrong. And the problem here, I really like the way that Laura cast the problem, so I'm just going to go back now, is that she says, look, over time, it might be really in your interest to pursue a long-term project, but at a time, it might be irrational for you to persist in that project. We might go through periods of rational doubt, for instance, where it's just not in your interest to continue pursuing the project, where the cost is very high. And so it might be the case that synchronic rationality and diachronic rationality recommend conflicting paths. And what faith allows you to do is to reconcile those so that you have something like integrity. Or if you need to adhere to a certain ideal, like you're adhering to democracy, I think it's one of John's examples. You really believe in democracy, you have faith in democracy, and then you look at the current presidential election and you think, this is a really horrible idea. I think I would prefer to live in like 18th century Britain. You might need something like faith in order to continue to believe that democracy is a good thing. Or you could give up that democracy is a good thing. But you might think that there's a great good by continuing to have faith that like democracy will win out and that our country will be better off for having a democratic election, even if Trump wins or something. Yeah, I know. That's an example. We're all feeling the burn right now. I wish we were feeling the burn. I actually really like burn. So there's some sort of, again, epistemic or cognitive impairment or like a non-ideal situation, as some of you have been talking about, and we overcome this through faith. And the upshot is that when faith is perfective of or good for its possessor, that is because the possessor suffers from one of these limitations. Faith wouldn't be needed if your evidence told you, like, democracy has always and everywhere, like, made people flourish. There'd be no reason to have faith. If you knew that your spouse was going to be faithful to you and you had good reasons for believing that, or very good practical reasons for acting as though that was so, and you had no conflicting practical reasons, then like, why would we need this added thing, faith? You would just like use your normal cognitive habits. So faith is only perfective of the possessors who suffer from these kinds of cognitive limitations, because it's only those people who need faith in order to achieve those goods that are in the first column. And if someone doesn't suffer from those limitations, it's my view that it's just unclear what special role faith would play, and so it would be like Oios or something like that. Okay, so given this setup, what is so troublesome about this view when you combine it with an Aristotelian account of what virtue is? I think there are two troublemaking theses, so I'm going to talk about them a little bit. And in this section, what I'm interested to do is to not only show you that people like really do hold these theses, because I think there's been some skepticism when I've talked about this before. Aristotelians don't really say that. And second, to like explain their motivations for claiming these things, which might seem to you crazy if you are not in this camp already. So the first thesis is what I'll call the virtue identification thesis. And it's just on the back of your handout, what I call V. And the claim is that virtue is something that's perfective of its possessor. It's something that makes its possessor good. And that there are traits that the fully virtuous person has and exercises. This is just like the analysis of virtue. And Rosalind Hershouse is sort of famous for getting this going, and people just sort of accept it and hop on the train and continue on that train. So what do I mean by, I think it's important to clarify what I mean by the fully virtuous person possesses and exercises that trait. So Hershouse herself says that the fully virtuous person exercises the traits which are virtues. So I'm just taking that from her. She doesn't give an explanation of like what it means to exercise, but I'm gonna, thanks to Rebecca, I realized I needed to clarify that a little bit. So here's my stab at it. I think there's a weak and a strong interpretation of exercise. So on the weak interpretation, one thought experiment we can use is imagine that there's a fully virtuous person who's living in a world where no wrongs are committed against her. Can she exercise justice? On the weak interpretation, she can, as long as she has the opportunity to perform acts from the vice, which is virtue's opposite, so like from injustice, and she refrains from performing acts of injustice. So even though there's no opportunity for her to like perform positive acts of justice because like no one's doing wrong to her. She herself isn't wronging anyone. And so that shows that she's exercising, she's doing something with her justice. Maybe that's one way of exercising a virtue. So on the strong interpretation, that's not enough. You would say something like, well, she possesses justice, but she's not exercising it. It's of no use to her in her life. So I was thinking about like maybe forgiveness in one of these worlds where like no wrong is ever done to anyone else. It just seems like, okay, maybe you could possess it, and I don't know why you would attribute forgivingness to such a person, but maybe she possesses forgivingness, but she's certainly not going to exercise it because there's not even an opportunity for her to do the opposite of forgive, like to be resentful or something. It's just not possible. So strong and weak interpretation, and we can talk about which of those is better. And no one in the literature that I know of like really fleshes out what exercise means, and so it's just like the first stab. Okay, so the fully virtuous person, imagine she just possesses a trait, but she doesn't need to exercise it in any possible world. Why would we attribute it to her? That's like a question I have. And then why would it be a virtue? So I want to give 3 motivations on behalf of the Aristotelian for keeping this exercise clause in the virtue identification thesis. Because some people have pressed me saying like, oh no, it just needs to be something that the fully virtuous agent possesses, and Hurst House et al. Are wrong to say she has to exercise it. But here are 3 reasons that they're not going to budge on that. The first one is heritage, just like they're trying to get Aristotle's view, or like an updated version of Aristotle's view. And Aristotle is pretty insistent that the value of virtue lies in its role in bringing about eudaimonia. It does that via activities. So the energeia of the virtue is like key to why it is a virtue instead of a vice, just some random natural habit. So I think if you want to follow Aristotle, then you're going to end up saying something like the virtuous agent really does act virtuously. She enacts the virtues, she exercises them. So a trait can't be a virtue unless it's the sort of thing that she's going to exercise, and it's going to be perfective of her, not just because she has it, but also because it's playing a role in her life and her flourishing. The second reason is practicality, and I think this is less obvious, so it's sort of a speculation on my part, but if you'll permit me to speculate. I think that Aristotelians are a little bit intimidated by other theories, normative theories, that give straightforward accounts of right action, where it's like, okay, and here's what you should do in any given situation. Like an undergraduate can just apply some categorical imperative or like a consequentialist rule and like out-pops the right action. And virtue ethics doesn't have that, because it's like, what's the right action? It's the sort of thing the fully virtuous person would do in similar circumstances, would characteristically do in similar circumstances. Not so easy. So, they're sort of behind on the practicality front, and I think that having the exercise clause sort of helps them on this front, because it helps you answer the question, well, why be moral? Look, you need to be moral because, or you need to have the virtues because it's the exercise of those particular traits that makes your life go well. So it at least answers the why be moral question and helps the Aristotelians sort of catch up with other theories on the practicality front, maybe. So that's my speculation, but second reason. And then the third reason is ethical naturalism, and this, I think, this is just going to be an independent commitment that comes along with Aristotelianism, but I don't think we're going to get any of them to move on this point. And the idea is just that we're members of the same kind as the fully virtuous person, and so we perform the same kinds of activities, or our characteristic activity is the same. And so if there's a trait that enables us to live well, it's going to be the same for the fully virtuous person. It's going to enable her to live well. And if it doesn't enable her to live well and we perform the same kind of activities, then it's just unclear why it would be perfective of us or beneficial for us. This also goes back to this practicality issue. So why would it be something that we care about? Why would we investigate virtue in the first place if it wasn't going to make our lives go well? the evidence that we have for thinking that virtues make our lives go well is that it makes the life of the fully virtuous person go well. That is, it like really makes a difference in practice for her. So reasons to keep the exercise clause in there. All right, so far, I think that there's no problem with V and thinking that faith is a virtue. It's really V and the combination of V with what I'll call the perfection claim that makes trouble. So the perfection claim, this is the one that I think people are incredulous that Aristotelians really say stuff like this. So I'm going to do a lot of quoting in this section, if you'll bear with me. The perfection claim is that the cognitive profile of the fully virtuous person includes the intellectual virtue, practical wisdom. This binds all the other virtues together. It infuses, like Dan Russell thinks, it infuses every single one of the moral virtues, has like as a proper part, practical wisdom. And here are some things that they say about practical wisdom on your handout here. One, John McDowell is really keen on this. It includes knowledge of general and particular ends. Philip says this too. She says practical knowledge includes knowledge of the relative value of particular ends, so you're able to judge the value to not just general goods like health and family, but you know in particular cases which one matters more in the situation. McDowell says that this includes the knowledge of how to live interacts with particular knowledge namely of all the particular facts capable of engaging with concern whose fulfillment would on occasion be virtuous. Very high bar. Okay. Second, they insist that practical wisdom guarantees that the fully virtuous person always gets things right. McDowell says that the fully virtuous person sees only the correct reasons, so not just apparent reasons. She's never mistaken. She never gets kind of false, misleading evidence about what reasons apply to her. She only sees the right ones. The wrong ones, the ones that are merely apparent, are just silent for her. So one thing that Hurst says that's interesting is that this is something that the fully virtuous person doesn't share with any other ordinary person. We just cannot perceive what we ought to do in dilemmas, and the fully virtuous person can. I think I said earlier, it unifies and infuses all the other virtues, and it produces what some of these thinkers call single-mindedness. So McDowell explained single-mindedness as a univocal, effective response to a situation. So you just feel one way about what you should do. You're not like torn or, John's like, it's not real. But people really say it. This is in the 1979 Knowledge and Reason. And then something that's been pointed out recently by Swartwood is that practical wisdom does not include a need to be responsive to self-regulating reasons. And these are just reasons that someone has to think about what their tendencies are or what they're likely to do in a situation, and then regulate on purpose. So here's like a silly example. I might think, okay, I know I tend to eat too many sweets and not really think about like what's nutritious for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my cupcakes with others instead of just like keeping them in my room because I know I'll overeat on the sweets. Right? That would be a self-regulating reason because really the object of it is something about me and my tendencies. Practical reason, or practical wisdom does not include responsiveness to those kinds of reasons because they're just not reasons that arise for the fully virtuous person. She has no such tendencies to like overeat her. Okay, so those are just some things that people say about this, the perfection that is characteristic of the fully virtuous person. Okay, why would they say these crazy things, or maybe crazy things? One motivation, Hursthouse is pretty keen on this in her 2006 paper. She says, look, virtue is rare. Full virtue is even rarer, and the ideal of the fully virtuous person is an unattainable, perhaps, but necessary ideal. Kimberly Brownlee, talking about aspirations and ideals, says, Look, substantive ideals are models of excellence or conceptions of perfection around which we can orient our thoughts and conduct. They can guide us in the growth and development of our characters, motivations, and intentions, actions, goals, commitments, etc. So the fully virtuous person sort of stands in for this ideal, regulative ideal, and it's something that we can use in thinking about like the sorts of people we ought to be and like how we ought to change our behavior, and that's all great. So maybe that's why we can idealize to this incredible extent. Bailey says that the perfectionist ideal is a necessary product of the commitment to the tight connection between virtue and right action. So in one respect, it's just inescapable for the Aristotelian. And this is Olivia Bailey in a paper that's arguing that the people who have tried to make practical wisdom more ordinary or attainable for ordinary people are just not being Aristotelian enough. She goes on to show at the end of the paper that there are certain commitments that are part of Aristotelianism that just prevent you from kind of lowering the bar. She thinks knowledge is entailed by practical wisdom. Okay. The second one is correctness. I think that this guarantee that the fully virtuous person gets things right is also doing a lot of motivational work. And this is what generates the reciprocity thesis, I think. So here's something that Bailey says, which I found helpful. She says, virtues should issue in nothing but right conduct. There will be cases in which different concerns pertaining to what we think of as other virtues might shape our recognition of what particular virtues require of us. As the exercise of one virtue will inevitably run into the concerns of others. Indeed, as there are no limits to the possibilities for compresence, as McDowell calls it, in the same situation of circumstances of the sorts of proper sensitivities to which constitute all the virtues are just best thought of as bound inextricably together. So look, if you want to be correct in every situation, you can't just have courage. You've got to have courage and gentleness and forgivingness, and what's going to bind those all together? Practical wisdom. So again, it's like this need for correctness sort of motivating the high bar. And then finally, this is again like a heritage point. I think that unless you have this commitment to the kind of single-mindedness, unified, effective response to the situation, the silencing of other reasons that might be appreciated by ordinary people that just don't show up as reasons to you. A reason for that is that that's precisely what distinguishes the fully virtuous person from the merely continent person. So I think of myself as a fairly continent person and not a virtuous person, and that's because a lot of times, being a moral philosopher, I can sort of like figure out, like I weigh reasons against one another, and I can sort of figure out like what the thing to do would be. But I definitely don't feel like doing it, you know. So what distinguishes me from like the Mother Teresa? She just like sees what to do, and she doesn't feel that she's torn about what to do. She just does it. Right? There's no one thought too many when it comes to saving someone. She's not going to like think twice before touching the leper, like I'm going to. What's the difference? I'm continent and she's fully virtuous. And Aristotle, in fact, thinks that continence is like worth very little. I sort of disagree about this, so maybe this is why I'm not as Aristotelian as I should be. But yeah, he doesn't think continence is worth very much in the moral life. And so he really wants to take care to distinguish what's the difference between the continent person and a fully virtuous person. Since they arrive at the same exact judgment, the difference is the conflict that the continent person feels, or maybe in her perception of the situation. And practical wisdom is the thing that blocks that. All right. So now we think we can move to the main argument, which is fairly quick. The first premise is just the limitation claim, beefed up a little bit now that I've explained it more. And it's just that fate is perfected only of persons who experience some inner cognitive limitations to goods that are needed for their flourishing. And this is the thing that fate circumvents. That's why you need some special cognitive habit. According to Aristotelian virtue ethics, virtues are traits the fully virtuous person possesses and exercises, which are perfective of her. According to Aristotelian virtue ethics, a fully virtuous person doesn't suffer from cognitive limitations that are incompatible with practical wisdom. And in detailing what practical wisdom involves for the Aristotelian, I think I've shown you some of the ways that the fully virtuous person just isn't plagued by limitations like conflicting reasons. So think of Lukács' view, right? You're going to have conflicting synchronic and diachronic reasons, or the appearance of the reasons is going to seem like it leads you in two different directions. But single-mindedness that comes out of practical wisdom just blocks that from ever even happening to you. So the limitation that makes faith valuable or perfected of an agent is just not present in the fully virtuous person. So I don't think that faith can be perfected of the fully virtuous person. It's not something that's going to benefit her in her life. It's not going to help her overcome some obstacle in order to achieve a good for her flourishing. And since virtues just are traits that are perfected with the fully virtuous agent, faith can't be a virtue. That's the idea. How am I on time? Because I forgot to start my...
Well, you know.
I'm done.
Well, no, you can
Okay.
wrap things up nicely.
Yeah.
We'll give you what time you need.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe I'll leave for Q&A more discussion of 4, 3 and 4. I'll do that. So the last thing that I want to say is that if you're like me and you think Aristotle's a really smart guy and there's a lot here and you don't just want to like throw out the tradition, and you definitely don't want to throw out the very tradition that is supporting like all the discussion of faith, how are you going to reconcile your Aristotelian leanings with the claim that faith is a virtue within the argument that I just went over? I think there are 3-ish options, or there are 3 that I can come up with. And the first one is to unidealize, so you just discard the stuff that the fully virtuous, that they say about the fully virtuous person in practical wisdom. I'm a little bit worried about that because of Bailey saying that it's just not compatible with major tenets of Aristotelianism to unidealize. But there's been a lot, there are like a ton of external reasons for unidealizing, aside from this current debate, right, the faith debate. So people like Jacobson recently says, advocates of virtue ethics embrace idealization without regard to whether it makes virtue humanly possible. So it like undermines the practicality of the view. It turns virtue ethics into a theory about what perfect and ideal people do, says Dan Russell. There's a dubious moral epistemology that comes along with it. And the ability that's described, practical wisdom, is not plausibly a human skill. So there are all these other reasons for unidealizing. So maybe like the faith people can just jump on board and say like, well, you already have lots of reasons for parting ways with Aristotle on this point, so maybe just go ahead and do it. You can't cope with the duty of self-improvement because the fully virtuous person has no reasons to improve. So if right action is tightly connected with virtues, and virtues are just identified with what traits the fully virtuous person has and are perfective of her, then you don't get any right actions that are right actions satisfying the duty of self-improvement. That's sort of unfortunate. Then the second strategy is to relax the connection between virtues and the fully virtuous person, and this is the one I like the most. So there's just, I mean, aside from the fact that Hursthouse did this in her kind of groundbreaking book, I just don't see reasons for identifying virtues with the traits that are protective of the fully virtuous agent. I know that there is a lot of pressure for calling things that are not quite what the fully virtuous person would have, or like are on the way to what the fully virtuous person would have, like helping virtues and stuff like that, but I just don't know why we can't dignify them with a better term, other than like a weird historical contingent fact about what Hursthouse decided to say in 1999. And so my proposal is that we sort of do both, so we just lower the bar a little bit on practical wisdom so that we make sure it's like a plausibly human skill, but maybe it's still going to involve like all these epistemic or intellectual virtues. But they're going to be the ones that like virtue epistemologists have already worked on and shown are humanly possible or like plausibly human. So I think the literature is also like really disconnected from the virtuous epistemology literature, and that's a shame. So we could do that, so lower the bar a little bit, not drastically, and then in addition to that, say, and look, a trait is a virtue if and only if it either is perfective of a human being or it produces states and goods which are themselves, or which when actualized, lead to states which are themselves perfective of the possessor or lead to goods which are themselves perfective of the possessor. So you have a sort of developmental view. And this is not like developed in any way. This is just a sketch of like one direction you might go. And there's a question about whether this is Aristotelian at all anymore, which I think Laura will raise, and I'll be curious to hear what you have to say. But that's the idea. Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, Anne. I should be holding a mic, right?
Yeah, there's
Some
a
kind.
handheld commentator mic that was left right on the
It's up here.
top.
Yeah, great.
Just switch it on.
It's on.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Well, so thanks, Anne, for a great paper and a great presentation. Make sure this works. Yes. Well, Anne's actually already addressed parts of my comments, so I'm going to try to keep this really fast. I know probably a lot of you want to get in on the Q&A as well.
You got your time.
Okay. I just wanted to step back and sort of, very, very big picture of what's going on. So Anne's thinking faith is a virtue. She doesn't want to argue for this right now. It's more of a stipulation, but she thinks this is very well supported. A number of people have argued for this from a number of different perspectives. So faith is a virtue. The neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics implies that faith cannot be a virtue. Therefore, we should reject or somehow modify neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics. Now, this is very interesting, and I take it, pretty compelling argument in its own right, but it also seems connected to some broader issues for the neo-Aristotelian and in philosophy of religion and how we think about faith. So here I want to just briefly highlight two worries for Anne's argument and also make a comment about those broader connections. Okay, so my first worry, which is already, in part addressed in the presentation, is that it's actually, it's really hard, in order to establish that neo-Aristotelian virtue theory rules out counting faith as a virtue, and needs us to adopt a certain understanding of her limitation claim. So recall how the argument for the tension between neo-Aristotelian virtue theory and seeing faith as a virtue is supposed to go. We've got number one, virtuous faith somehow requires cognitive limitations. We've got to be in a non-ideal epistemic state. But two, virtues are just those traits that would be had by a fully virtuous person, and three, fully virtuous people, at least for the likes of McDowell and Hursthouse, are not limited in the required ways. But Anne needs us to accept a somewhat more specific version of the limitation claim than what she put in her paper in order for this to work. So first, we've got to accept that the cognitive limitations are of the right kind, the kind that fully virtuous agents wouldn't have them. And as Anne pressed very well in her presentation, these neo-Aristotelian virtue people, they do make very sweeping claims for the cognitive abilities of the fully virtuous agent. But nobody thinks that the fully virtuous agent knew that the earth revolved around the sun before the rest of us, right? These people aren't omniscient. And, Hursthouse says things like there can be non-culpable, ignorance, you can get misleading evidence, you can be wrong about factual stuff, even if you are a fully virtuous agent. It's a little hard to square with you'll be guaranteed to get it right in every situation regardless of what the situation is, but it's at least, when I read Hursthouse, what I understand is that she thinks practical wisdom involves full appreciation of the general principles of human flourishing and morality, and an ability to sort of flexibly apply this in different situations. But you don't have to be omniscient, and you don't have to never get particular facts wrong. You don't have to never get misleading evidence in particular. So yeah, I don't see any reason that even these neo-Aristotelian virtue people are committed to thinking that the fully virtuous agent has a sort of supercomputer for a mind, and so they're not unlimited in their ability to assess evidence. For Anne's argument to work, it had better not be the case that the cognitive limitations faith requires are just things like non-culpably limited or misleading exposure to evidence for and against the existence of God, or limits on sheer rational computing power in assessing evidence for God's existence. Okay. However, such things are sometimes claimed as the limitations that make faith virtuous, and I think this problem may be compounded when we realize we also need to adopt a certain conception of the way in which faith requires these limitations. Bear with my diagrams. I hope you can see sort of what's going on here. Anne's paper really made me think about the way in which faith requires these cognitive limitations. So you might think that the virtue of faith lies specifically in its power to sort of circumvent or get around these cognitive limitations that otherwise would come between us and some great flourishing good G. This is supposed to be on the left-hand side. And without those limitations, it just wouldn't be necessary or valuable for us to have faith. This seems to be the way that Anne's roughly thinking about faith, given how she puts it in her main argument on the handout. But there are other ways to think about faith requiring limitations. You might think that faith is a direct, perhaps unique means of achieving G, but it just happens to require us to be in a cognitively limited state in order to make use of it, or even contributes to being that state. It's a kind of side effect. And Anne considers some arguments to this effect in her paper that make use of this middle kind of a requirement. But we might also think of faith in a third way, as actually overcoming and eradicating certain cognitive limitations, which would otherwise hinder us in achieving G. If faith is a means of overcoming cognitive limitations, then those with faith no longer have those same cognitive limitations, in a sense. So the faithful person, like the fully virtuous person, isn't going to struggle with cognitive limitations, although maybe she would if she lost her faith. So, and indeed, if faith is a continuing means of overcoming cognitive limitations, so it's not a mere ladder to be kicked away, and those with faith might again suffer from cognitive limitations if they lost their faith, then it seems faith might still count as perfective of people who don't suffer from these cognitive limitations. Moreover, I do think it's somewhat common and plausible to think of both the content of the cognitive limitations faith requires and the way in which faith requires those limitations in ways that won't work for Anne's argument. So you might think, what we lack is this sort of sufficient evidential state for rationally believing in God at some particular time. Well, maybe faith can actually make it rational for us to believe in God at that time. Or we lack knowledge or understanding of God's plans and purposes for our lives. Well, faith can generate that understanding or that knowledge. Sure, we could instead see these cognitive limitations, like a lack of rationality or knowledge, as problems to be circumvented by faith, but we might see them as deficits that faith can actually fill. Anne discusses Lara Buchak's view, faith in her paper. I think Buchak might see faith this way. Evidence buffets us in various directions over the course of our lives, and this is a problem because it makes it difficult for us to rationally stick to important commitments. Well, she's insistent. Faith doesn't allow us not to just cope with this buffeting somehow, or rationally maintain beliefs in spite of it, but it actually makes it rational for us to hold a steady course. So this first worry is meant to encourage Anne to say more about the continuing cognitive limitations that faith requires, and the possibility that faith may not require that one remain cognitively limited in the relevant way. Okay, setting that worry aside, if we accept that faith is a virtue possessed and exercised only by those with certain cognitive limitations, it seems to me it's going to be in really good company. And Anne talked a little bit in her presentation about some of these self-regulating virtues, I mean, Neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics is going to have a problem countenancing a broader class of commonly acknowledged virtues for reasons similar to those Anne has here highlighted. After all, open-mindedness might seem to be a virtue only because or when we're sufficiently likely to be mistaken or biased in our beliefs. Self-discipline, she talked about, might be a virtue only for those who need to improve themselves or otherwise restrain vicious impulses. You know, courage and patience might be different depending on how we think of those virtues. But if we understand the exercise of both as requiring something like a temptation to exaggerated feeling that has to be consistently overcome, right? Plausibly, I don't think the fully virtuous person is even going to be able to exercise that virtue, going to be in no danger of such exaggerated feelings. So in general, seems like this is going to easily extend to broader worries for the Neo-Aristotelian, who's going to want a unified way of understanding, what you might think of as virtues of the limited. Okay. So finally, I want to raise a worry about the modifications to Neo-Aristotelian virtue theory that Anne, briefly proposes at the end of her paper, concerning the extent to which they remain Aristotelian or retain some of the attraction of Aristotelian virtue theory. So to review, Anne worries both that Aristotelian theory disqualifies faith as a virtue and that it ignores the essential connection, for ethical naturalists anyway, between human capabilities and the virtues. So it stands to be too demanding in holding us to an impossible standard for our kind. At the end of the paper, she proposes these modifications that are supposed to improve the situation. In particular, instead of saying virtues are all and only those traits possessed by the fully virtuous person, we are to allow that certain traits could be virtues for humans with different capabilities than those possessed by the, actually most virtuous person in this world, or some sort of, super person imagined by Hursthouse and McDowell. We can admit that faith might not be a virtue for humans whose cognitive capacities exceed those common in our world, and for humans whose cognitive capacities fall short even of what's possible in our world. Well, a trait would count as a virtue for them if it was needed in order to become an excellent human, and if it also secured certain human goods. My concern is that the most excellent person in the actual world, or the fully virtuous person, kind of wherever you put that index, doesn't seem to maintain any important role. So it sounds like the most excellent person is just at one stage along a continuum of excellence, each stage of which is going to require different traits. It sounds like whether a trait counts as a virtue for a person will be radically indexed to that person's own capabilities. Okay? This isn't necessarily a terrible thing. It is somewhat plausible to think that people need varying kinds of moral traits depending on their developmental needs and capabilities. But minimally, we might think for a theory to count as a broadly Aristotelian virtue theory, there should be some important explanatory connection between the fully virtuous person and the virtues themselves. I mean, part of what's attractive about this Aristotelian picture is that you've got a hook, you've got a picture of the flourishing human being, right? And what it is that he does, some people say actually grounds these various traits that are going to count as virtues. But minimally, you might think it's the compelling. There should be an important explanatory connection because it's this picture of natural human flourishing that really is sort of setting the gold standard for the traits that we all ought to be developing. If the most excellent persons in our world are just at one stage along a continuum of excellence, it's not clear to me what that important explanatory connection could be. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Laura. I just want to thank Laura for her really excellent comments, which she got to me far in advance, so I get to really think about them, and also for making up for my lack of PowerPoint and creativity. Which I found the slide about, I put on the slide about the limitations. I found the slide about the limitations like really illuminating because I realized that I conflated and just like ran together the first two and didn't even consider the third. So I do want to say something like, it's either that we start off with these limitations and they persist, and so faith continues to be valuable until we say get to heaven and see God, in the religious faith case, or the limitations are somehow circumvented so they don't make a difference to how things turn out for us in everyday life until we get to heaven, and then they're no more, and then there's no need to circumvent them, and so we don't need faith. So that was really helpful. But this is a really important point that Laura makes, and one that I just need to think more about and like hear more about from others. Some of the reasons that I think we couldn't just fold in faith to one of the, so one idea would be faith is one of the cognitive excellences that a person with practical wisdom has, or probably part of practical wisdom, something like this, okay. And so nothing is, it's like eradicating certain things which would arise and would be obstacles, but they don't arise because we've got faith. So maybe that's one way to interpret Laura's view, Laura Buchek's view that Laura has given us. That's really interesting. I think that there are just like obstacles in the literature for affirming that view, but I don't see why we, if we can say like, well, lots of Aristotelians have just misspoken. I don't see why we can't just get past what they've said and revise our view of practical wisdom so that faith gets incorporated as one of the virtues, intellectual virtues that is a proper part of practical wisdom. But I think the single-mindedness criterion, the sort of continence issue, which I didn't bring out a lot in the paper, but is motivating me when I'm thinking about why they're incompatible, that continues to arise in my mind. So I just think the self-regulation, the aspect of faith that is self-regulating seems to be key, even if you make it a proper part of practical wisdom. And if it's self-regulation, then I don't really, like, it's anything about your perspective, so not like the evidence that's out there, but your appraisal of the evidence. If your perspective of the evidence is involved in any way, then I think it's kind of self-regulating, and then it turns out to be incompatible with a lot of what the Aristotelians have said about practical wisdom. Maybe they just need to stop saying that. So I think that was a really good point, just something I need to think a lot more about. And then the view that I'm proposing at the end, which Laura like really nicely and succinctly summarized in a way that I did not. So thank you. I think she is right that it would have implications for other virtues that, like, obviously the Aristotelian wants to include, such as courage. So like that requires fearsome objects, right? That's a great example, I think. I think maybe I should just use some of those in the paper to push the Neo-Aristotelian further, because the project that this is a part of is a project to get Aristotelians to be like more Thomistic in their Aristotelianism, and I think that this is the view Aquinas would like, where all of these virtues are virtues that might go away in a heavenly state or something like that. They're like connatural virtues, not supernatural. Or like if you get the Holy Spirit, then certain of them go away and get replaced with infused virtues. So I really like that, and that's something that I need to add. I'm appreciative of. So thank you very much, Laura.